Welcome back to the Mythic Dungeon International here. We've seen Black Mamba be eliminated by a company. Now we'll be moving on to the winner's bracket, that upper finals with Team D versus Battle for Champion. I'm Jack, and joining me on the desk right now is Sloot, Zyronic, and Sours, as we're about to go into the game of seeing who is going to make it into that grand finals and compete for that first place spot. Before we do so, going into this map with Shrine of the Storm here, Sours, it's been a nasty dungeon that we've seen thus far, and a lot of potential for some sloppy play.
Yeah, it's a really gross affixes in Shrine of the Storm, if I'm being completely honest. Fortified Sanguine Necrotic is pretty brutal, and this dungeon is actually the reason why Battle for Champion is first seed in this tournament instead of Team D, where Team D was actually faster in both of the other time trial dungeons, but only 50 seconds faster in those two dungeons than Battle for Champion, but they were a full 2 minutes slower in their Shrine of the Storm during time trials, which is a lot of time.
Yeah, especially with the limited practice format that we have, only seeing 5 attempts on these dungeons to see. It makes a pretty considerable difference, Ironic, compared to when you were competing previously where you had all the time in the world.
Yeah, this is actually like a very, very different format in terms of last year. Like last year, we could practice the dungeons for almost an entire week before we even had to worry about even going for these super fast runs. In addition to that, last year there were a lot more teams streaming progress, so we could kind of like pick and choose strategies that we wanted to run. And actually, we even ended up kind of like pioneering one of the strategies with one of the trinkets plus Windwalker Monk cooldowns on one of the bosses, and then people started copying that strategy. So it was definitely, there was a lot more strat sharing last time around than there is this time. These teams are being very secretive with their strategies.
Yeah, and we've seen that how these teams have been able to kind of grow, or even the Eastern region being able to watch how the West has already played this out here. But taking a look here, we are seeing the Assassination Rogue and Unholy DK here coming out here, Sloot.
Yeah, I mean, Unholy DK, not too shocking, I suppose. I mean, there's quite a lot of trash density in the dungeon, so not too worried about seeing that. The Assass, I mean, certainly can hold its own. It's not the first time we've seen it throughout any of the cups. We did see it a few times, actually, in the West Cup last week. So, I mean, Team D had a pretty successful time on this dungeon as well. So, obviously, they know what they're doing, especially with the kind of caliber of play that they had yesterday. So, definitely curious to see how it's going to work out for them.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious about this Assassination Rogue pick here, Sours. I mean, is it just that they have so much AoE already that they're just trying to feed up the Unholy DK a little bit more or something?
Yeah, if you have an Unholy DK, you don't need 2 Outlaw Rogues, so it's better to have the other Outlaw Rogue go Assassination for single target damage, because he's going to do more single target than the other Outlaw, and he's going to be doing significantly more single target than the Unholy DK, and you're still going to have a second Shroud, which is very valuable in these dungeons.
We've seen how much the Shroud skips have been imperative to a lot of dungeons, but we were kind of talking behind the desk here, Zyronic, about how some dungeons being on the rails versus just having free and open space here. Shrine of the Storm really makes you kind of work to get around a lot of the trash here.
Yeah, especially on, I mean, typically you're playing around the affixes. So like last week in the Western Cup, we saw these teams pulling a lot of trash before the first boss, Aquaster. But this week, because of the Sanguine affix, we see them skipping most of the trash before the first boss and opting to do the trash later in the dungeon just because of how difficult it is to deal with Sanguine as casters.
Yeah, and we've had to see, all of the line of sight movement to be able to get around it. I know it's kind of been the bane of our existence, Sloot, when we were kind of running around trying to make sure we're getting into the tightest corner possible to make sure every caster gets right on top of us here.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just an extension of what Zyra said. It's not even about the casters plus Sanguine. It's about that this has the most notoriously awful reaping that is, of any dungeon almost, especially with the first 20%, is just caster, caster, caster. You have a million Grave Bolts going on. The tank can't control it because they're on random members. So, I mean, they have a nice amount of interrupts, certainly with the amount of melee, but not for, 12, 13 casters.
You saying not even a prop pally could handle that one?
Well, I mean, perhaps, but
ooh,
wouldn't see in the future.
All right, we'll have to see then. Sloot will now be going into all Shrine of the Storm keys instead of the tanks. Looking forward to it. We'll see. But looking at this next couple matchups that we have going past this, as we're making sure that all players are online and ready to go here. Motherlode and Freehold here. We've seen a couple Motherlodes so far, Sours, and as a game 2 that we have to start watching out for with Tyrannical, Explosive, Skittish, that's also not too friendly following the Shrine of the Storm.
Yeah, this is a pretty bad trash series of all the trash series we have, starting with Shrine Sanguine, brutal, and then we go into Motherlode, Explosive, that's a yikes, and then another Freehold Sanguine shortly after that. This is a really trash intensive set of dungeons in the Cup series, so that Unholy Death Knight AoE is very valuable if you can pull around it.
Yeah, and we have to see, how much, even though it is on the 18, even though they're having that 415 gear, it really makes you start seeing when the affixes get kind of turned on and get set up for, you know, the nastiest things possible. They really got to work for it here. So starting up with game 1 between Battle for Champion and Team D. Team D looking to have Twitch chat's advantage here at 65% here. The winner of this series will show who will go on to that grand final as we start it up in Shrine of the Storm.
Zyro, good to have you on the desk here. This is going to be, you know, we said this yesterday too, it's going to be a bit of a slugfest, but, you know, if there's 2 teams that are prepped for these dungeons, this particular one with the nasty affixes, it's these 2.
Yeah, these 2 were the top 2 teams, especially in all 3 dungeons actually in time trials, with Shrine of the Storm being the only dungeon that BFC had a better time than Team D, and so it's actually going to be, you know, kind of like a slugfest here. Like you said, Team D is going to have to prove that they're better than BFC on this dungeon. It was a fluke that they messed up.
We're actually seeing a really nice snap coming in from Team D as they run all the way downstairs. A lot of caster mobs get pulled down there, and we see them snap right on top of that kind of a torch brazier. The warrior is already out of there. You do not want to be dealing with the amount of water bolts going off. You only have that spell reflect once every 25 seconds, and as soon as it is consumed, it is gone. So Team D, the prot warrior playing it extra safe, everybody helping to slow as he runs away and looking to kill everything on the stairs as it's kind of kited out of the Sanguine naturally.
Yeah, but the unfortunate thing about this, the thing they have to be very careful with, which I like what they're doing, they're kind of grouping everything up here, is if they're just have everything spread out coming up the stairs, they don't really have that much control for Sanguine, and because they're running an Unholy Decay instead of a Windwalker Monk, they only have the 1 knockback from their Druids, so if they get bad Sanguine and they've already used their only available knockback, it could get even worse for them.
So it looks like they're, ooh, that was a bit of a far jump from the Prowler there. That was actually really scary. You can very easily pull that living current water elemental there. It does have true sight, but nonetheless, no damage done from them. Team D just moves into the last trash, major trash at least, before Akusir, the first boss of the dungeon. Battle for Champion already working on that too. As you can see, Zyra, of course, both teams have not yet procced that Reaping.
Yeah, we saw the similar pulls yesterday from the teams that ran Shrine of the Storm. It looks like generally these teams are proccing their first Reaping Wave with the first boss, and they're planning on pulling that Reaping Wave into the boss because it's right next to them. They're not going to be able to Shadow Meld it off. And we're going to see probably an advantage early on for Team D because they do have that Unholy DK to funnel that AoE damage from their Festermite buff into the single target boss damage. And they do have Bloodlust available for that as well, so we'll see how far ahead they'll get from the Unholy DK on the single target.
Yeah, certainly both teams having that Bloodlust. We are, of course, back into that necrotic setting that we saw in the previous series with Atal Dazar, where the tanks will get increasing stacks of a dot, a damage over time bleed, along with a healing reduction, 2% per stack. But we also have the Sanguine, not for those unfamiliar just joining us now, it are those pools that drop on the ground that heal any enemies in them and damage you if you stand in them. So you want to make sure you're moving away from them. A lot of damage coming in here for Team D as that first Reaping Wave is pulled on top of Akusir here. 943 left on the Bloodlust, so we do know they popped the Bloodlust, obviously, shining over there in the top of the screen, doing well to dodge that first surging rush as well, and trying to get to that phase 2 ASAP.
Yeah, and we do see a little bit of a variation from Team D as well. They did opt to pull the 2 Galecaller Apprentices with the boss here, which will drop Sanguine when they die, so they need to be very careful where they kill them. They need to make sure they're away from the boss. The Sanguine pool doesn't spawn underneath the boss. That's incredibly close there.
Very dangerous. That is a very dangerous pool. I mean, it's beside the boss, but the bigger problem really is it's going to be beside one of the Aqualings when the boss hits 50% in just a moment here, where he splits into 3 Aqualings, and he can Surging Rush to that location later right on top of it. So they're really having a bit of a gamble here. The other one is killed in the middle of the room. We know the boss and the 3 Aqualings cannot actually be present in the middle of the room, so that one's a bit safer. I don't know if they can get a tick of healing as they Surging Rush through it, so we'll have to see. I think not, but hopefully that works out for them. Seems to be premeditated and largely intended. Nonetheless, Aqualing number 2 about to fall here for Battle for Champion. Now, Zyra, it is important to stand within melee range of all these Aqualings because, like the boss, if you're not there, it will pulse a lot of damage onto the ground.
Right, and that AoE pulsing damage in addition to all 3 sets of abilities going out at the same time can be incredibly difficult. We did see a little bit of a different variation in strategy in this intermission phase from both teams. BFC opted to go for the safer route and kill one of the Aqualings first, so they only had to deal with 2 of the Surging Rushes at the same time instead of the 3 that Team D had to deal with. But we see them actually catching up on the side of Team D because they went with the more DPS efficient route of DPSing all 3 down evenly.
And they have the 5% slight trash advantage as well, so it could come into play later in the dungeon. 0 deaths across the board for both teams as we see the debuff being dispelled for Mog right now. That does actually do some damage over time on you and slows you. Should you get hit by any of the swirlies that spawn after that dispel, you will have that debuff reapplied. So 15 stacks or 16 stacks now for the Protection Warrior on Battle for Champion. It's a fair bit of stacks actually on a single target boss, you do want to drop those, but again, he can't really get out of melee range from the boss to kite by virtue of the fact that the boss is rooted into place. Killing these last initiates here that do guard the first mini-boss as they're planning to completely skip it. Both teams, it looks like.
Yeah, and usually we'll see teams pull those 4 initiates because they need to have access to the side route that we see the warrior and the monk going on here, so that they can actually get past this mini boss. This mini boss tends to have too much HP for teams to deal with, especially on the fortified setting. So most teams will just opt to skip all of the mini bosses in this section of the dungeon. You
know, kind of shocked to see that. At least Battle for Champion did not opt to use their their mass stealth there for one of them. They do have 2 of them available. One of them should be coming back off cooldown within the next minute a bit, and one of them, of course, will be used for Soren's room. So I'm not really sure what they're going to want to be saving that second one for. But cheat death does proc for one of the rogues on Battle for Champion, getting clipped by those Iron Hull apprentices. Certainly don't want to be in that whirlwind, especially if they're buffed with Blessing of Iron Tides. A lot of extra damage coming in from them. And really, the biggest danger here, Zyra, is they don't have a lot of room to move, and Sanguine is just dropping all over the place with mismanagement of mobs' health.
Yeah, we saw one of the teams yesterday, I can't quite recall which team it was, have an awful time with Sanguine in this hallway. They had to pull the mobs outside and then back inside the tunnel because their Sanguine management wasn't good enough. But it looks like Team D is dealing with it a lot better than the team did yesterday. Now, we did see a couple different pulls from here. BFC opted for 2 smaller pulls, whereas Team D decided to go for almost all of the trash in the dungeon at the same time. So if they're able to pull this off, this will put them just that much ahead.
Yeah, that, and actually, I remember the pull you were talking about yesterday. That was disastrous. Not only that, but they ended up proximity pulling Sorn as well because they just ran out of space with all the Sanguine everywhere. They did end up making the best of it, if I don't recall. But let's focus here for a second. Battle for Champion just now finishing off the rest of the mobs that they pulled for Sanguine, as Team D does a perfect skip on Sorn, dealing with that rather large and dangerous pull. Long looking like they're going to just fully skip all the rest of this trash. I think Sorn came with them. Oh, they're looking to skip completely the second round of Reaping as well, as the tank sacrifices themselves and is rezzed on the other side. Now, one of the Risen Souls unfortunately did leak, but not a big deal.
Yeah, the healer was already casting the mass res out of combat, and you don't get canceled whenever something just kind of gets in res. So that was good. That was good of them to make sure they get that res off there just for the one Risen Soul. It could have canceled the healer's res if it managed to attack off on the healer, but you know, they got the res off, so it wasn't that big of a deal.
Would have lost a bit of time, but not a big deal. Really loving to see the organization here from T&D, as that patrol was double sapped right on the side with that 3-pack of apprentices there. So really well done by them. Just a lot of clean play. I love to see this. Kind of, you know, a bit reminiscent, honestly, of Method U's play last week. So just very, very clean here. Team D pulling a few of these initiates that guard entry to the second boss area, making sure to kite them properly in the tight space that they have, as to maximize efficiency of area denial from the Sanguine that does go down. But Long having a bit of struggle with HP right now.
Yeah, well, we also did see them use their only knockback on the very first initiate death, just to make sure that nothing healed out. So he had to make sure that he had to perfectly kite those ads there. So he had to stay in melee range to make sure that they weren't casting too many things. And we see on the snap, this didn't work out for a team yesterday, but it looks like it's working out for them perfectly fine.
Yeah, perfect snap here as they get the initiates down in the water, slow them, punt them, and make sure to kill them all perfectly at the same time. So none of those Zyra, dare to go in those pools of Sanguine.
Oh, no,
now, pools of Sanguine do stack, of course, so they made sure to perfectly kill all of those initiates in one spot before they got insta-healed, essentially, from it. And Team D already right over to the second boss, Brother Ironhull and Galecaller Faye. The two bosses, of course, mimic each other's abilities, both drop runes, and both have their specific empowerments. Galecaller Faye specifically has this ward that she puts on the ground, increasing speed and haste of anybody in it by 25%, including the enemies. But at 100 energy, she also gets a buff that if you interrupt her, which you need to, for the frequent spell that she casts, 3 melee rotation for the Slicing Blast, she will spawn kind of tornadoes around the room, Zyro.
Right, and on the other side, Brother Ironhull also drops a rune on the ground. You can see it right there. If you stand in that, or if the bosses stand in that, they get a 70% damage reduction. So obviously you don't want the bosses to be in there. In addition to that, if they're inside of that rune, they also remove any debuffs. So any bleeds, any damage over time abilities will get removed from the boss. So they need to make sure they're kiting the bosses around, making sure they're not inside the runes for too long. In addition to that, Brother Ironhull will also buff himself with a massive damage increase that the tank will need to kite out of, or maybe stand in the rune, or just face tank it like a man.
Or just face tank. 4 casts now, 6 stacks on the Blood DK right now, so perhaps a bit sloppy with their interims. They certainly have them available now. I know, of course, they can cleanse this debuff in that area, but you know, they did get a bit low there, so I believe, a bit of mismanagement from the Interrupts. Nonetheless, they are looking to kill Caller Faye first here, as she will fall at 19%. We've seen teams implement two different strategies here. Oftentimes, one is where you kind of kill both bosses at the same time, a more DPS but mechanically unfriendly addition of the flip side, which we're seeing here from Team D, as Gale Caller Faye will be killed first. Now, what I like seeing as well, Zyro, is that the Prot Warrior, at least a couple of times, not looking like he's doing it this time, but just a tip for those at home, the Warrior with Necrotic can actually go into Brother's rune as well and clean your necrotic stacks.
Like we mentioned, it does clear debuffs, so that includes necrotic, that includes the slicing blast debuffs that go off whenever casts go off. So any debuffs pretty much in the game, any magic debuffs will instantly get cleansed there, and we did see him cleanse there. Now, you mentioned that we saw a couple of different things where sometimes teams would opt to completely focus down Gale Caller Faye or just completely cleave them down. They were kind of like in between a little bit. They were cleaving a little bit, but they were also focusing just a little bit more on Gale Caller Faye. I believe Ironhold was around 40% HP when Faye died, so that means they only had to do a little bit of single target damage.
Yeah, Long doing well there, of course, to sidestep that frontal hindering cleave, which snapshots the player's location, so you can easily just sidestep it. Team D here downing the second boss and already getting some extra trash pulled to it by the Rested Druid, which moved just slightly ahead of the group. We see Army coming in here from the DK. Now, this is a particularly dangerous pull. There are two Enforcers in here, plus of course, the Ritualist. Now, the Ritualist needs to have his Shadow Bolt AoE volley interrupted, else it will hit players for a moderate amount of shadow damage, but increases the shadow damage you take substantially for any subsequent casts. The Enforcers themselves, there's actually three, they pulled the Patrol as well, just absolutely destroy tanks with their Deep Smash, which is why you're seeing Long here be so defensive and safe by kiting away from them. If you're 15-20 yards away from those Enforcers, they will not cast their Deep Smash on you.
Right, that's why we see him kiting around so frantically here. He just wants to make sure he doesn't take any damage, and we see him getting incredibly low. That might have been just one or two Deep Smashes. If he gets hit by every single one of them at the same time, he's down for sure, and that's a battle res on the board for them. But we see him just actually pretty perfectly kiting these around. He's kind of going slow enough so that the kicks are easy to get for the rest of the melee, but not too fast so that people are frantically running around the room. Very, very great kiting from Long there.
So it looks like they're going to be proccing their 60% third Reaping Wave here, after which I expect that they're just going to, as quickly as they can, run through the Tentacle Room that we always skip. The remaining two Enforcers and just Shadow Meld on top of the safe bridge area. There's a long stretch of bridge here that is just completely mob free. So here they go. We see them, the Shadow Meld coming in, and Team D moves up the bridge right now to grab some of these caster packs. Not sure if they're going to deal with this Tentacle pack. We'll see in just a moment here. And they do indeed, as the two cultists are taunted down. You want to make sure that the two tentacles that spawn Reveal Darkness here are killed either just no mobs are killed under them because they're immobile with Sanguine, or once you kill them, you want to move those mobs away from the Sanguine. So a bit of tricky play here from them.
Yeah, they definitely have to make sure they're focusing their passive cleave here, making sure they're focusing on the tentacles first. Like you said, if any Sanguine goes below them, their tentacles are stuck in the ground. They can't move at all. So if anything dies on top of them, they're going to heal to full, and they have to wait for the Sanguine to go away. If you go too far away from the tentacles, they'll start smashing the ground and doing massive group damage. So you're just going to sit there for 60 seconds looking at these tentacles, wondering why you did what you did there.
Colossal Smash, certainly something you don't want on a group, especially in this fortified setting. Mental Assault going out of that cultist. Team doing well to sidestep that snapshot frontal that will stun you and deal just a bit of damage to you if you stand in it. Now moving up to the rest of the bridge. Now, they need about 80% trash before they move over to the fourth boss. So between this bridge and the tentacles in the next room before Lord Stormsong, they will complete the remaining trash they need. We'll see exactly how they want to handle their fourth Reaping Wave. But this is actually a really big pull coming out here. We see some of the silences with Garrote coming out of their rogue as well. This is a lot of caster damage that can go on the tank. A lot of CDs have been popped here just to stay alive, but Rip Mines and Void Bolts, certainly two very dangerous casts for the tank, as one does get off, but has that shield wall ready. Right,
and of course you also have to mention the mental assaults that are frontal abilities, that if you get hit by them, we also get stunned for 5 seconds and be just pretty much out of commission for 5 seconds. In addition to that, doing a lot of damage to anyone that gets hit by. So with all of these mobs together, there's multiple mobs casting mental assaults, there's multiple interrupts, there's multiple Rip Mines. So many Void Bolts, so many interrupts going off here. This is probably one of the most dangerous pulls in the dungeon.
And plus the Sanguine as well with a bunch of caster mobs. They only have access to really that one punt with the Typhoon on a 30-second cooldown from the Rested Druid. Opts to use it there at the end. So honestly, just almost perfectly done by them. No Sanguine healing from the mobs. Everything dies fairly closely together. No deaths. It was just really well played by them. 76% on the board. Killing one side of these Dweller tentacles right now will yield just sub 80. So they will not proc their fourth Reaping Wave yet. Of course, over on Battle for Champion, we see that Bloodlust has been popped on a similar pull on the bridge, so they won't have that available for the bosses now, but they do manage to get past the same pack and are once again back neck in neck with Team D.
Yeah, definitely an advantage for Team D still having that Bloodlust available for either of these two bosses should they choose to use it there. We can just see the difficulty of that double pull on the bridge with BFC opting to use their Bloodlust just to make sure that pull went off without a hitch. It's just a super dangerous pull, and to see Team D pull it off without Bloodlust is very impressive.
So Team D, of course, does proc their 4th Reaping Wave there, and you can see them all Shadow Meld right away. Now, they did have a couple of mobs snap to them, teleport. We can see just one Tormented Soul here, but you know what? Advantage Blood DK, or Unholy DK, perhaps just a bit at least, but really not a big deal for that to be in there. They just interrupt the Grave Bolt, and no danger. It doesn't even displace them with Area Denial. Nobody actually interrupted the Grave Bolt as I said that, but nonetheless, no casualties suffered by the team. As they've started now on Lord Stormsong, will have that Bloodlust available for what looks like the 4th boss once they get to that room there after they kill Lord Stormsong. But let's talk a bit about Lord Stormsong first, Zyro.
Yeah, Lord Stormsong is a really interesting boss. It's just kind of a cyclical boss. He has an interrupt that you need to interrupt with a 2 melee rotation. He also casts Rip Mind at random players in the group, which is just extra damage to single target damage to enemy players in the group. And he'll also occasionally spawn these 5 Shadow Balls. Now, if you hit one of the Shadow Balls, you'll be stunned and take massive shadow damage. But the main mechanic to get rid of these Shadow Balls is the MC, the Ancient Mindbender.
Yeah, the Mindbender, you want to make sure you run through those balls. Now, 5 of them is not enough actually to take you to the threshold of percentage that drops the mind control on the player. So teams often either try to kind of pre-immune or pre-vanish the first cast to make sure that it doesn't go on you, or if they do, they'll eat the 5 balls and then kind of run into that pool in the background there that we see in the back right. That does damage you substantially as well. But the more efficient method, of course, is to skip that first one. Now we see that there are 10 balls kind of circling the players and 2 per player fixated here. Once we get the Waken the Void cast in just a moment, we'll have 15, and then we'll have more than enough damage for the first MC target if they even get to it. I mean, Lord Stormsong is now at 17% for Team D. They're just rifling through it, but you know what? Not far behind in terms of single target, and this is where the advantage of the Windwalker comes in, especially with that physical debuff. Battle for Champion closing the gap as well.
Yeah, this is actually incredibly close, and like you mentioned, they're both just ripping through this boss right now. It isn't a fortified setting, so the bosses don't have as much health as they would on Tyrannical, as they do get that last Ancient Mindbender cast as the boss dies. But both of these teams are just incredibly close. Now, we're going to have to see what that Bloodlust will do for them. You know, most teams don't really have too much of an issue getting through one phase on the last boss here. We did see one team barely not make it, but every other team that has been on Shrine of the Storm so far has been able to make that timer to make sure they only get one intermission phase. So maybe that's just a safety thing for them. Maybe they're going to use it to deal with trash during the intermission quickly. We'll have to see where they use that Bloodlust.
We'll also have to see if anybody embarrassingly gets hit by any of these jellyfish here that will stun you for 8 seconds through immunity as well, so I don't think they'll be able to kind of sneak out of that one. But the players do well to kind of avoid everything right now as we see these lovely druid shapes here from our observers right now moving into the final boss room. Now, this final boss room consists of 4 packs of eels, about 7 to 8 eels per pack that give a substantial amount of percent, and 3 denizen mobs here in front of the final boss. Now, name of the game here is that what will happen, they will actually go and pull the boss. Sometimes eels will largely get accidentally pulled, sometimes on purpose. 1 or 2 packs. We're actually seeing both teams deal with some of the eels right now and the denizen bag. Okay, so everything I was about to say goes completely out the window right now for Team D as they opt to deal with the trash before the boss. A lot of damage coming in on their Unholy DK as he has a lot of necrotic stacks and the shadow stacks from the eels. Fortunately, he manages to get away. Long at 46 stacks, 48 now of necrotic, barely surviving as it takes him down right now. Gets saved though and manages to kite out as the melee are making sure to interrupt those forgotten denizens without a cat. That was scary.
Yeah, I'm actually, you know what the impressive thing is, I'm about 90% sure that wasn't on purpose. We saw the shrouds coming out from the rogues there to try to skip past the eels, and they ended up pulling them accidentally. So just the presence of mind is saying, oh, we have an Unholy DK, let's just go ahead and pull both of these packs onto eels on top of the 3 mobs so we can abuse that massive AoE damage. And we see the difference in AoE damage that the Unholy DK was able to deal there. That was just a really impressive, like, it was an on-the-fly call from them, I'm pretty sure, and it was really impressive to see.
Certainly on the flip side is the more traditional route that we see from teams over on the left side with Battle for Champion, where the boss is actually aggroed first, and during this boss fight, the healer gets a debuff that stacks up to 9, that increases your damage done but decreases your maximum HP. By doing that, you're actually allowed to stay in the boss phase after transition as he just sits there casting, doing nothing, and they will go and kill the trash using that healer's substantial damage buff just to make it a bit more efficient. So certainly a bit untraditional, I suppose, from Team D, but as you said, Zara, perhaps it was just a mistake and they capitalized on it.
Right, and the important thing to mention as well is about the healer debuff. Not only is it a 90% damage and healing debuff, it's also a 90% health reduction. So if any AoE damage mechanics go off, or gets hit by any of the tentacle slam mechanics in the fight, the healer's a goner. Now on the side of Battle for Champion, they don't have a battle res for the healer, but they do have a battle res in the form of the DK on the side of Team D for that.
They do, and 2 battle res is available for Team D should they need it. But at this point, with how close the 2 teams are together, it would actually be pretty detrimental for either team to have yet another death. Team D now still has that Bloodlust available, and they've killed the majority of trash. So here they go. They're probably going to spark up that Bloodlust. There it goes right on them as it shines on the screen, looking to one-phase Volzith right now. And after doing so, they will be able to move over and grab the final eel pack. They might actually even pull it at the same time as the boss is dying, but a lot of damage coming out for them, as 43% now for Volzith on Battle for Champion, but they still have 7% trash to deal with.
Yeah, they have 7% trash to deal with on the side of BFC, with only 3% on the side of Team D. Now this fight isn't completely over yet. This isn't a figured out fight. They also have to make sure that they're kiting the bosses away from these small little manifestation ads. If any of them hit the boss, they'll explode for AoE damage, surely killing the healer, who, like we mentioned, is at 90% reduced health. We see the Monk Ring of Peace coming out on the side of BFC just to make sure those ads don't hit the boss, and this boss is going to go down at the exact same time for these 2 teams.
Exact same time as we see the death from Battle for Champion come in first. 2% for Volzith. The eels start coming in for Team D as they look to finish them off right now. Battle for Champion still needs to deal with 2 more packs. Only 1 here for Team D. It's looking really good for them as they're looking to close off the first game in a very close fashion. Team D takes the first game of the series over Battle for Champion. Only a few seconds apart here for the 2 teams. Whew, that was the performance that I was looking for these 2 guys. That was a lot of fun to watch.
Very strong performance there by Team D, making sure they're taking that early lead and early advantage there. I really like what we saw at the very end. If you saw it very quickly, if you stayed in combat after Volzith died, the healer kept the damage buff, so it instantly shifted into cat form through Caution to the Wind. It just started swiping like crazy there, Sours.
Yeah, that was a crazy dungeon. Like, it was so close. Both these teams went faster than even the fastest time trial of the dungeon, which is really impressive. The one death that Team D had was like it was a sort of calculated death where they sacrifice their warrior and then they get a mass res on him, and they just pulled ahead. Like, the time on the first boss, there was like neck and neck, only a couple of seconds in between them. But then when we get over to our second boss, Team D is a full minute and a half ahead of Battle for Champion. But then Battle for Champion, they caught up. They found some way to make up that minute and a half of the dungeon. They were like neck and neck at the very end, like only a few seconds separating them at the very end of this dungeon. Like, this is the kind of like crazy close matches we've seen all of these Chinese like series happen that wasn't happening at all in the West Cup. So this is really crazy.
Yeah, and excellent. And the fact that they were, like you mentioned, 2 minutes faster than their time trial time was incredible to talk about how much they've improved on that. We're going to be bringing it over to a quick break before we go into Game 2 between Battle for a Champion and Team D. Don't go anywhere, guys. The MDI will return. Team D with their powerhouse Death Knight have taken Game 1 on a Shrine of the Storm. Now we're going to be moving on to Game 2 in the Motherlode here. I'm Jack, and joining me on the desk is Sloot, Zyronic, and Sours, guys. And we were talking about it during the break, Sours. That was just a very impressive performance that Team D was putting on. But also, must be said that Battle for Champion was quite close behind them.
Yeah, Battle for Champion only had like one really bad dungeon yesterday in their King's Rest. And besides that, they were playing out of their minds. And they were playing really crazy in this dungeon as well. They had one small death just before the second boss where the warrior ended up going down when they're fighting a lot of casters. Cost them a little bit of time, a couple of seconds, 5 seconds on the death clock. They used the battle rest, so the druid isn't doing any damage, isn't really doing any healing. And like we were talking about it, that time difference is probably why they lost the dungeon. Who knows? Like, it was so close. And this Motherlode, I think, is going to be a lot of the same, where Battle for Champion has yet to run a Death Knight in this entire tournament, be it time trials or in the tournament itself. And if there's going to be any dungeon to whip out a Death Knight, I think Motherlode is a very good dungeon to do so.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be, where those teams both have to play lights out in the Motherlode to make sure they're going to be able to pull through and not drop down into that lower bracket here. But I think at this point, Zyronic, if they're not playing Death Knight in other high-density trash dungeons, do you think they're going to go for here?
No, we don't really tend to see these Chinese teams swap comps too much. We saw a couple comp swaps from Buff or Nerf Rogue yesterday, but that was pretty much all we've seen this entire tournament.
They're also a Taiwanese team.
True, also true. but the point kind of remains. These teams don't tend to swap comps too much. We do see actually a swap here, though.
Yeah, just the specialization swap here as Baby Pig going from the Assassination Rogue into Outlaw Rogue there. So quick switch up, and no surprise there, Sloot, as we're going into something that is just massively heavy trash density.
No, not at all. I mean, this is a dungeon where you see all trash, at least 99% of the trash being killed before the second boss, plus all those explosives spawning.
Yep, and diving into the Motherlode, this is going to be Game 2 in the series between Battle for Champion and Team D here, the winner of which will move on to the Grand Finals.
I mean, Motherlode is just, we just talked about it, Zyro, very, very trash heavy, but a bit of limiting factor in terms of the pull sizes here that you could do, especially before the first boss, not only through the existence of what should be, if I'm not mistaken, explosive in here, but also just there's a lot of trash that does residual damage on the group.
Right, and the other one thing that I don't necessarily think Unholy is the greatest thing in this dungeon is we like to see the Unholy DKs pulling Reaping Packs into bosses, and this is one of the dungeons where you take care of all of your trash instantly, right away at the start of the dungeon, so there's not too much of taking advantage of that Unholy DK single target on bosses there.
So both teams with a similar pull here as they pull into the kind of the first hut down the hill. A lot of Peacekeepers coming in, as you mentioned, Zyra, and those explosives on the side. We get that bloodlust from both sides immediately. Similar to what we saw the strat yesterday being as well, but there's just a lot of trash to shoot through. We're going to have a lot of high health Peacekeepers doing a ton of damage to the tank and their corresponding Reaping mobs that spawn with 50% baseline health from them. So we are now, of course, seeing the correct affixes on the screen. We have the explosives that we've seen. Orbs will spawn randomly from anything in the dungeon, really, and if you don't kill the orb by the time the explosion timer goes off, it will hit anybody in line of sight for 50% of max health. Now, the second affix, usually not too much of a concern, Zyra, especially with a prot warrior there for Skittish.
Yeah, definitely. We're not really going to see that Skittish affix come into play too often, unless maybe perhaps the warrior tank gets disoriented by something in the dungeon, instantly dropping all of their aggro. But I'd hope that these teams are good enough to not do that. We see Long dropping incredibly low just from the mechanized Peacekeeper damage, though.
Yeah, a lot of damage coming in, and of course we've already seen that cheat death proc, unfortunately, for one of the two rogues for Battle for Champion. A bit of sloppiness on the pull there. Now, it is worth mentioning, especially with the Skittish, it's further made kind of a not dangerous affix for the team, because they have two rogues with Tricks of the Trade every 30 seconds, just pumping all of that threat into the tank, so not a problem for them. A Battle for Champion now dealing with their first Reaping wave as they kind of tag along with some extra trash, pulling some more. Mech Jockeys of particular danger, especially if they don't get into the Peacekeepers. They will cast Grease Gun on random close proximity members, not even the tank all the time, so that is something of splash damage that you want to be worried about, along with those adult thugs, Zyra, that charge range targets.
Yeah, and this is where you see the power of the Unholy DK, pulling Reaping Packs into massive trash packs, jumping up to almost 600k AoE damage there, making sure all of the Reaping is instantly gone, and they only have to deal with one or two of the trash mobs that they have left afterwards. So explosive, not too much of an issue if there's nothing left to spawn explosive.
Ab Kitty pouncing on that explosive as it comes up for Team D, just absolutely destroying that first Reaping pack along with extra trash. Literally, I mean, quite frankly, be carried by the Unholy DK damage there. Getting ready to prop up for another large pull and destroy their second Reaping wave here in a second as well. Battle for Champion is as well dealt with their first Reaping pack, moving around this kind of circular area of trash right before the first boss. Now, one mob that we didn't talk about just yet, Zyra, but is particularly dangerous in here are the vendors. Unfortunately, Death coming in, though, just before we go on to that thought for Mog. Cheat Death not available, so first, Team Death coming in potentially for Battle for Champion as well, as everybody's dipping quite low. We did not have that Cheat Death available from the first rogue as they progged it on that first pull. Bit of a mess here with the explosives going on, just trying to recover. Cheat Death for the second rogue has procced as well as the Windwalker gets quite low. Looks like they're finally managing to stabilize, but part of what set this off in the first place is the danger of those vendors that we were talking about.
Yeah, the refreshment vendors are probably one of the most dangerous mobs in the entire dungeon. They have two main mechanics that need to be interrupted. They first of all, they have their channel ability, which will target a random player in the group, deal pretty heavy damage, and if that channel does get finished, the person will be frozen for several seconds, not able to help the group out. In addition to that, they also have the Kaja Coal Refresher, which, if let go off, is an undispellable healing buff on all of the close enemies. So both of them have to be interrupted. In addition to that, you also have to deal with the thugs and the assassins at the same time. So it's just these trash pulls are incredibly dangerous to deal with.
Yeah, just a lot of attention needed. Inhale Vapors interrupted there, well done so by Battle for Champion. That will increase their damage output by roughly 50%, something like that. So making them very, very volatile, dangerous mobs. Second Reaping wave coming in here for Battle for Champion. Team D following suit, pulling two mechanized Peacekeepers plus that Reaping pack. Expecting in just a second here to see that Unholy DK skyrocket in damage, as this is a quite high density pull. They're leaving an explosive on the side, managed to finally cleave it down, and here comes the Unholy DK damage, just melting that Reaping pack that has come in and looking to just destroy the rest of the pack that they pulled.
Yeah, one thing to mention as well, that it might seem like it's a little dangerous here, but Reaping doesn't tend to correspond with dungeon affixes. So while they're spawning, 30, 40 mobs with the Reaping pack, those Reaping mobs can't actually spawn explosive, or, they don't also respond to Sanguine or anything like that. In this dungeon, they only have to worry about the mobs they're actually pulling to spawn explosives. So that's why we're not seeing tons of explosives popping off. We do see the warrior dropping incredibly low for Battle for Champion here.
Yeah, of course, and really the only kind of affix that works with Reaping is Skittish, because that's baseline from the tank themselves. But we already mentioned with the Prot Warrior, really not much of a concern for that, as they kind of thunderclap themselves to victory. Battle for Champion now 46% on the board, as they're slowly grinding around this outside area prior to the first boss, as we'll see. Both teams likely engage somewhere in the very rough region of 80 to 90. Usually try to get that fourth Reaping done for most teams before that first boss. Team D at 53%. We'll actually be soon proccing their third Reaping wave as well.
Yeah, and once again, we'll probably see a Reaping pull into another large trash pull, and we'll see the Unholy DK pop off, 400, 500, maybe even 600k damage. We just see that too many times for them.
I would never have guessed it. But as you say that, the Unholy DK is starting to slowly rise up and finish off over the rest of this pack. There's the 60% perfectly calculated by Team D as they move forward with the Reaping pack coming in. And let's put it to the test, Zyre. Let's take a look at those damage meters. Now, we see the rogues skyrocketing just at the start, but as everything kind of gets in there and people start managing the explosives as well, the Unholy DK just kind of prepping to rocket up in damage. And just a second, I'm expecting to see that jump up, but I'm not actually seeing it as he starts chunking quite low. Okay, there we go. Now he's starting to get above the second rogue as well. Most of the trash is done, so not the highest peak that we saw from before, but likely not having all of the cooldowns available either.
Well, yeah, also they kind of need all of the mobs to be alive, and it looks like the rogues were kind of killing them off before he was able to actually get all of his damage set up. It does require quite a bit of setup to get done properly, so there's a little bit of time spent there making sure that they get all of their setup done. Now, we mentioned that these teams like to get 80 to 90% of their mob count before they even get to the first boss here, and that's just because the trash in this beginning part of the dungeon is so much easier, and on top of that, so much more efficient than the rest of the dungeon. Moving into the R&D area, and also between the third and fourth boss later on in the dungeon, all of that trash is incredibly dangerous.
Absolute nightmare, that pack. Looks like we have an explosive go off for Battle for Champion. Now, it will not instant kill you, but it will deal 50% of your max HP. It does get mitigated by whatever kind of passive mitigation you might have on your character, things like versatility or avoidance, should they have it on their gear. I don't think actually they have any avoidance on their gear, but certainly versatility, if they have any pieces with that, will mitigate some of that damage. Battle for Champion, 66% now, working towards their fourth Reaping wave, but Team D just kind of keeping the same distance margin with their front lead. 75% on the board from them. Looks like this 3-pack will likely proc their next Reaping wave, which I expect that they'll grab right on top of that first boss. No Bloodlust available, though.
And no Bloodlust available, but this boss tends to, the mechanics of this boss kind of lend themselves to not wanting to use Bloodlust, especially when you have an Unholy DK. The Unholy DK just scales so much exponentially with AoE damage. I wouldn't be surprised to see them use that second Bloodlust on another AoE pack after the boss.
Yeah, and there's also the possibility of them just going right past the boss,
True.
dealing with a bunch of trash there, and then backtracking. We've seen that several times from some teams as well. Explosives being well handled there by Jack as he runs around in kitty form, making sure to help the DPS cleave those down and have no danger, so that they could just output maximum damage on this leftover Peacekeeper plus Thug combo. A couple of mech jockeys in there as well. Want to be careful with that for their grease gun. That will hit players, so he wants to make sure that the Rogues and the Windwalker are nice and healthy so they can absorb some of those hits. Here comes the fourth Reaping wave, and indeed, the first boss coin-operated Crowd Pummeler has been pulled for Team D.
Yeah, now looking at the coin-operated Crowd Pummeler, we were talking the reason this boss tends to not have Bloodlust used on it are these bombs that we see going out right now. Each of these bombs, when kicked into the boss, will increase the boss's damage taken by 50%, and it stacks 3 times. And each time he gets hit by the bomb, the debuff refreshes. So what you'll typically see teams do is kick 1 or 2 bombs into the boss, or specifically they'll kick 2 bombs into the boss, wait until the debuff is almost gone or the third bomb is about to explode, then kick the third bomb into the boss, making him take 150% increased damage. And that's why we're seeing these obscene single target DPS numbers out of these players.
Yeah, I certainly want those foot bombs going in, and nice benefit there for the Unholy DK as well with that fourth Reaping wave on top of the boss. Doing well, of course, just to sidestep that frontal there. That will stun you and deal a fair bit of damage. Now, the static shock is something to be noted on, and also this boss movement. You're seeing these piles of gold go down on the ground. Now, players are seemingly not interested in it for some weird reason, because, we're both broke on live, but avoiding them as the boss will try to absorb them with buffing his damage by 10% per pile permanently for the remainder of the fight. So you do have a bit of finite space in the room before you will start to gain damage buffs. But at this level, and with honestly just the kind of caliber and cadence of these teams, you're not going to run out of space before the boss keels over.
Yeah, and I like to see the efficiency out of these teams too. They typically will relegate the bomb kicking to the healer here, because the healer is doing the least damage as possible out of all the players in the group as possible. And on top of that, all of the damage in this fight is it's on a timer pretty much, so you know exactly when it's happening, so you can kind of preset for it. They just kind of, like JB said on Twitter yesterday, you kind of just slap that soccer jersey on him and say, go get him, champ.
Yeah, I mean, you get those bombs kicked into the boss, and this healer not missing a single one. Certainly our friend Jack could take a note of in the back room right now, as his foot bomb skills are certainly not the most up to par. Team D now at 25% on the coin operated crowd pummeler, 52% still on the board for Battle for Champion. You would expect that their single target, of course, is superior to Team D's. We actually saw that in the last dungeon as well, just by prowess of that Windwalker being in there with that physical debuff for the team, as well as icing on the cake, if you will. 14% now for Team D as they look to close it off and move over to the next trash. Right,
and we do see the little bit difference in trash percentage here too. We do see Team D has 5% less trash percentage than BFC, but that's not too big of a difference, right? That's maybe 2 or 3 mobs. And yeah, they do. BFC does commit their bloodlust to the end of the boss here, which is kind of an interesting timing if you think about it. But since they're using it this early, they might have it back up for a 3rd bloodlust even later on in the dungeon. It's going to be very close, though.
I mean, that's a bold strategy, Zyra. We're going to have to see if that one works out for them, but likely it is based on some timing later in the dungeon. It looks like they're actually going to waste a lot of that bloodlust timer, so hopefully whatever timer they intend for the end of the dungeon is worth about a 25% loss on that initial bloodlust. 10 seconds left on it. Maybe they actually will not waste as much as we thought. Boss about to go down here for Battle for Champion, as we see a stealth into the middle of a large pile of mobs for Team D coming up right now, getting ready to grab everything together. Now, you want to make sure you're interrupting these rock lances for the tank, because if you don't have that spell reflect, a lot of damage coming in as well, along with dodging the bombs from the sappers, Zyro.
Yeah, and of course the thing to mention when you're pulling massive amounts of mobs like this, every single one of them has a chance to proc explosives. So any of those explosives go off, it's massive amount of AoE group damage in addition to letting any of those rock lances go off. That can one-shot a player with an explosive going.
Absolutely, but the speed at which they killed the pack, just by virtue of especially the Unholy DK's damage there, they essentially had 5 DPS AoE at the level of the rogues and the Praw Warriors there, with double damage coming in from Unholy. They just hacked that squad down so quickly there. Bloodlust finally coming up, the second one, of course, for Team D here on Azarok, the second boss of the dungeon. Very front-loaded boss in terms of difficulty, as these Earth Ragers will start their fight and fixate a random players. You can see if they start connecting melees with the players, they will stack a bleed damage over time on them, as the rogues are struggling to kind of kite around in circles. They don't have too effective of a slow and peel for them, so Tree of Life being popped here by Ab, the Resto Druid on Team D, struggling to heal through those bleeds as the rest of the team tries to just cleave down these Earth Ragers before things get out of hand, whilst dodging those frontal tectonic smashes.
Yeah, these Earth Ragers are probably the most dangerous part of the dungeon for a triple melee comp, because if every single one of the DPS gets fixated, nobody can actually sit there and do damage. They have to kite around in circles. And we see that last rogue on the side of Team D had a double fixate and 7 bleed debuffs. The fact that he's even getting healed through this right now is incredibly impressive from the healer.
Very impressive, and he didn't even proc his cheat death. It got close a couple of times there, but really well done by Ab. Finally manages to top the rest of the group off. Main danger with those Earth Ragers is done. Manages to get into cat form and just get right at it right now. Battle for Champion here, of course, moving up, not using one of their Shrouds, but I'm expecting a Shadow Meld here in just a moment. Indeed, as they skip the last Reaping pack by doing so, which is why we didn't have the Shroud. They were stuck in combat from that 5th Reaping wave, and it's something that they're now done with for the rest of the dungeon, minus a couple ones that leaked in, but we'll have to keep a close eye to see how well they do here at the start of their Azarok pull without that Bloodlust availability.
We see Jack going down incredibly low. 3 players incredibly low on the side of Battle for Champion at the start of this boss, and the Windwalker goes down as well, but the healer can't sit there and battle res him here right now. Oh, he does actually, which is pretty dangerous, but
is actually pretty lucky. He managed to drop his bleed stacks just as he needed to get that battle res off, so managed to kind of stabilize everything there. But another death on the board for Battle for Champion, on top of the 2 they had, now making 3 15-second timer, 10-second difference from Team D's 1 death. They do manage to finally stabilize, but unfortunately definitely lost some time there because of that death, and that was actually almost a wipe. I mean, that Resto Druid was so close to dying.
Yeah, it was incredibly close, and it just shows, I mean, Team D definitely had the safer approach using the Bloodlust at the start of this boss, because the start of this boss is just so dangerous, like we mentioned with the triple melee comp. Having BFC get through that with only 1 death, not having Bloodlust, I mean, I'd take that any day, honestly.
I do agree with that. Team D now down to 12% on Azarok, as you see a bunch of trash being pulled in here on purpose so that they can proc their final Reaping wave just as Azarok dies. Doing so, they will actually take the minecart down the kind of hill there into the R&D area, and then rush as quickly as they can to the third boss room and use that Shadow Meld. They'll be so far away from the third Reaping Wave that even with the massive aggro radius of those Reaping mobs, they won't be able to have aggro. Maybe one or two will leak, we'll see. But Team D nonetheless has killed Azarok, looking over here to finish the last 5% of trash as they will head down the hill. Still 40% left on Azarok for Battle for Champion, even though they've dealt with their 5th Reaping Wave. Certainly a bit behind. Long here having a bit of trouble with some damage incoming from these last mobs.
Yeah, like you mentioned here, they're going to look to proc their last and final Reaping Wave here, and then they'll move on to the third boss where they'll Shadow Mode both all the trash they ran past plus this 5th Reaping Wave. So the second this Taskmaster goes down, we might actually see them mount up and run down the path instead of take the minecart, because some of these DPS aren't really going to be able to run too fast. We do have 2 rogues, so they'll be able to run fast, but that Unholy DK, he's going to be waddling after everyone else.
Unholy DK didn't care. He just left the rest of the team there in the cart, just making sure that they finish it off. Of course, not the DK is not known to have the best mobility in the game. Certainly one of their drawbacks as the team gets downstairs here and manages to start running over through into the third boss's room for Rixa here. Azarok now at 2%. Not going to lose any time here for Battle for Champion as they've already dealt with a Reaping Wave. So right after this, they're just going to get right in that minecart and head down the hill immediately. So Team D certainly still slightly ahead, but it's a bit deceiving. They're not that ahead.
Yeah, they're definitely a bit ahead. I think, honestly, they're more ahead because of the 2 extra deaths that Team Battle for Champion has rather than just where they are in the dungeon, because Battle for Champion is going to be on this boss in the next 10 seconds. So looking at Rixa Fluxflame, this is another one of those area of denial bosses that we see at the end of Motherlode here. Both this boss and the final boss are big area of denial. You'll see Rixa Fluxflame target 1 player, put a bunch of goop on the ground, and then he'll target another player and also put goop on the ground there. And then also he'll go through 2 cycles of blowing away the goop on the ground. So it's managing your positioning, making sure you're leaving room to stand in the group. And on top of that, he'll also place debuffs on these players.
Yeah, and not just the debuffs, so there are the chem launchers that go onto the 2 players right now, the 2 closest proximity players we should mention, of course, from Rixa. Now, they have a plethora of immunities and pre-AMS they could use for some of the DPS, but the tank will either need to get dispelled or can, of course, spell reflect this every 25 seconds from long, but it does a lot of damage, and this boss, particularly on Tyrannical, is very dangerous for the tanks as it does pure fire damage, not blockable either, so you're going to see a lot of ignore pain spam coming out of long. Of course, you still want to maintain that shield block for the extra shield slam damage, but Rixa now down to 65% already for Battle for Champion. We know they have the superior single target damage because of their composition. Unholy DK versus the Windwalker Monk that BFC is carrying right now, so they're actually quite quickly catching up to Team D.
In addition to that, they'll also have their Bloodlust off cooldown earlier, which means they'll get more of a chance to use it where they want to use it on the final boss. So we're going to have to see if that actually will make up for that 10-second loss, in addition to, the 5% or so behind on the bosses they are. In addition to also the better single target comp. This is going to be incredibly close at the end of the dungeon.
It's going to be very close as that gap keeps closing from Battle for Champion. 5-6% now down to only 2-3% between the 2 teams. Team D looks like they're getting their second round of cooldowns out as they start to kind of spread that DPS out and spread the gap between the 2 bosses out. 25% left on Rixa as the team is doing well to bait that propellant blast into the various directions of the Azerite goop on the ground, making sure that they don't have too much area denial and have the freedom to move as needed, depending on where the vents kind of shoot out some extra area denial. 24% now as Battle for Champion is still working on Rixa, but they're starting to kind of reclose the gap as more CDs are coming up because Team D widened it once again.
Yeah, it's kind of impressive, actually, how close together these teams are still at the end of the dungeon with their separate comps. We see how much more damage the Monk is doing on the side of Battle for Champion versus the Unholy DK, but Team D has been consistently about 5% ahead for the entire time they've been on this boss. So the fact that they're doing the same single target damage with a worse single target comp is pretty impressive.
I would actually be curious to see those kill times on that boss specifically. I do reckon that Battle for Champion actually did kill it a bit faster. Nonetheless, both teams right away, we will see the double stealth here as they run past these mechanized peacekeepers. Now, these do have true sight, so at some point, the protection warrior will need to grab this final pack that we're seeing for Team D here and drag it to the side in order to kind of just shadow meld and get rid of it. But they're actually not. Everybody's running upstairs and they will shadow meld it together as a team in the corner just to not have the extra death. We're seeing the strat that I was talking about coming out of Battle for Champion where the prot warrior pulls it to the side and then Heroic leaps onto the platform using that shadow meld. Both teams engaging Mogul Razdunk at the same time.
Yeah, Team D maybe only pulled it a couple seconds beforehand. They're almost, we're almost going to see identical mechanics coming out from these groups just because of how close they are together. Now, we mentioned that both of these last 2 bosses are huge area of denial bosses. All of the mechanics that this boss does are going to make sure you cannot stand in a particular spot. We see on the side of Battle for Champion, the gap Gatling gun going across, which is going to be a circular mechanic that you need to move out of. If you stand in front of that Gatling gun, you're going to take a massive amount of damage over time.
Yeah, and not just that, we do see these kind of mechanized heads rolling around the arena. Now, if you imagine the arena kind of as a 3x3 grid, or just a rough 3x3 grid, one of them will occasionally deny a row, while the other one denies a column that we can see well there on the side of Battle for Champion. So players need to make sure to pre-move to those safe locations, because you can see well ahead of time which areas are going to get kind of flamed upon by those missiles. Now, you want to make sure you move ahead as well, because this boss is a big pain in the butt to move for the tanks. He just so often casts several things, actually, including this Gatling gun that makes him immobile, so you want these melee to have access to damage the boss at all times. 30 seconds, Zyra, as well, as you mentioned earlier, on the Bloodlust for Battle for Champion.
Yeah, and it looks like for Team D, that Bloodlust probably isn't going to come back up, so that Bloodlust could be the complete difference, the time makeup for Battle for Champion, for those extra 2 deaths that they have. The one final mechanic that we haven't talked about, of course, are the rockets that will occasionally go on any ranged DPS members of the group. Now, because these groups are both running triple melee comps, the only ranged person in the group will be the healer, so every single time a rocket's about to go out, you'll see the healer move out of the group and then move back in after exploding the rocket only on themselves. We see these intermission phase here, yeah.
Yeah, intermission right now as we see these Azerite Heartseekers come in for Battle for Champion for the 2 ads that spawn the Sky Scorchers. Now, finally, Bloodlust does go up as Mogul Razdunk gets out of the phase transition for Battle for Champion, looking to just finish him off as quickly as possible. They do have a 10-second deficit to overcome. Unfortunately, that Missile Seeker does clip the tank as well. So you can see the Prot Warrior dipping quite low here, down sub 20%. Jack doing what he can to make sure that he heals him up to safety as he gets a bit of a breath as Mogul starts doing his Gatling gun attack, which he does not melee the tank during. 42% now for Team D as they get out of the transition phase as well.
In addition to that, also Battle for Champion got out of the transition phase 1 stomp earlier because of the slight bug where sometimes player pets will get hit by the stomp and the boss will think that the player pet getting stomped is one of the pillars. So they did get out of that phase a little bit faster just because of that. Now, their Bloodlust is gone. They are 25% or so ahead on the boss with only 10 seconds that they need, of a disadvantage that they have.
Yeah, it's going to be really close as Battle for Champion is battling for tournament supremacy right now, making sure that they don't get denied down to the lower bracket. The boss does fall, 10 seconds on the clock for Team D, but I mean, Jad, there's just no way that they're going to finish off the remainder of this boss within the last 2 seconds, and Battle for Champion tie up the series at 1 apiece.
Very strong performance by Battle for Champion, staying alive in this upper bracket and making sure Team D has a run for its money here. Very impressive performance going into this run here, and a little bit more creativity as we've seen previously. Team D really trying to take a page out of a lot of the Western region's book here, Sours.
Yeah, Team D was doing some huge pulls in the beginning, really kind of enabled, right, by the Unholy Death Knight, where there's a lot of really dangerous trash in the first half of this dungeon. We talk a lot about it, where there's not only a lot of single target abilities that you have to kick in the refreshment vendors. They're going to be, of course, channeling the Ice Spritzer on people. It can be doing a lot of magic damage, and if the cast goes to completion, then it's going to ice block people. There's also the concussion charges coming off from the various mobs there that are you have to dodge things on the ground. There's wrenches that are being thrown everywhere. A lot of unavoidable damage that these teams are really kind of have to figure out a way to deal with through enough damage. And the race on these bosses was like so neck and neck. Once again, we've seen it in these dungeons where the first boss was very, very close, and then the second boss was, there was a bit of a gap. But then on Rixa Flux Flame, this team was able to just kind of catch back up. The Windwalker single target was enough to kind of keep them like neck and neck, and then even to allow them to just like be like so close behind that it was like who's gonna win still. And then I guess that final mistake on the last boss, I guess the missed pylon, that extra time that you just can't afford to have happen is that sealed the deal, and Team D is going to Game 3.
Yeah, and Battle for Champion really showing its grit here as we go on to the Game 3. It will be on Freehold. Don't go anywhere, guys. The MDI will return right after this break. Battle for Champion showing their determination to stay in this upper finals, taking that win in the Motherlode here as we move on to Game 3, the first of the Game 3s that we've seen in this entire tournament so far. Next game is going to be Freehold, sorry, and we're going to be able to see who will join us, Sours, in that grand finals there between Team D and Battle for Champion.
Yeah, it's going to be another hopefully neck and neck dungeon. The series we've seen out of all the East teams so far has been crazy. Where like we see like 20-minute 5 seconds from Team D, but it was like a 20-minute and 10-second from Battle for Champion. And then similarly in Motherlode, it was like only like a 10-second difference again between how they were able to pull it out. Freehold is another dungeon. We talk about how like important the Unholy Death Knight is for enabling massive AoE pools, but really, like, how much are they saving on these massive AoE pools versus that 5% physical damage debuff brought by the Windwalker Monk for the entire dungeon, which saves you a lot of time on bosses as well as a little bit of time on those trash packs as well.
Well, I'd say with how aggressively that Team D has played, I mean, look at Shrine of the Storm. They've made enough aggressive plays to make sure that they got value out of that Unholy DK, and Freehold is going to be the perfect dungeon for it, as we saw so many Western teams bringing that Unholy DK out for them. But Game 3 between the upper finals between Battle for Champion and Team D is starting right now, the winner of which will go on to the Grand Finals.
Back to the Freehold, as Jack likes to refer to, starting off with the dungeon here. Now, Zara, we see two different strats here, actually both employing the second strat that we usually see, where you just kind of mount up, you get that mass stealth going, and you get right into the first boss's room, aggroing 20% of the trash.
Right, and they're planning on proccing their first Reaping Wave here, and probably pulling it with the boss. We've seen this from so many teams. This is just kind of like the default de facto strat we see most teams doing now. This is a little bit more dangerous for the East region because they have this sanguine pull. And I mean, we see the rogue instantly dropping to about 20% there.
Yeah, of course, just to remind those at home, we are back in a Sanguine affix along with Grievous. So Sanguine being the pool that drops under trash mobs when they die, that heals trash, but also does damage to players should you stand in it. So you want to kind of calculate where you drop these pools and slowly kite mobs out of them as they're dropping to make sure that they don't get healed. Team doing well there for Team D to make sure that the Enforcers don't toss the tank across the Sanguine pool and therefore chase them through the Sanguine pool, leading to just a bunch of healing and extra health that you need to go through. But Grievous as well is pretty dangerous in this dungeon.
Right, we were talking about it earlier when we saw Freehold earlier today. It's incredibly dangerous on this first boss because you're running this triple melee comp. The only person who can outrange the shots from the boss is the healer, so these melee are going to be taking shots to the face the entire dungeon if they're not properly spread out. Multiple people will take shots, and they'll start stacking up the Grievous stacks. I mean, we even saw both of these healers almost going earlier today, so we'll have to see how these two healers are going to deal with this affix here.
Yeah, even right now, there's a couple of 4 stacks, which is the maximum stack of Grievous you can have for Team D, as finally Ab manages to heal through it, and they pull the boss perfectly as that first Reaping Wave comes in for both sides. Bloodlust immediately being popped, both sides a piece as they look to kind of chew through this. So a lot of advantage coming in here for the Unholy DK, likely early, as we're going to see that damage ramp up for them in a moment. But once again, you know, I mean, as Sours mentioned, the 5% physical debuff is nothing to kind of write home about, and it looks like the Unholy DK really didn't get as juicy damage out of that as you'd think and hope they would.
Right, pretty much all the advantage of running the Unholy DK there is going to be all of the burst AoE spores that will pop on top of the boss, plus he gets a little bit of a lingering effect from the 15-second Fester My Strength debuff. But instantly, we just saw it there. 2 melee get hit by one of the bursting shots from the boss. That instantly has to be healed out, of those Grievous debuffs are going to start stacking up.
Yeah, you got to make sure not to get clipped by that, and of course one of the disadvantages from those Azerite powder shots coming in with this full melee comp is that you just don't have that much room to spread around the boss, so you have to maintain a lane for the boss to have access to the range so that nobody gets hit, hopefully, by it. And the melee also need to spread out just enough, but the rogue getting comboed there with the Guano coming in from the Parrot flying above as he gets the Azerite combo too. Bit of miscommunication here from Team D as they get rushed as well by the Parrot. Death coming over for the Windwalker on Battle for Champion, so a lot of struggles with this first boss coming up for these two teams. Battle Res already gone for Battle for Champion as he gets chunked again with that powder shot coming in from the boss, Zyro.
I mean, we can't stress how difficult this boss is on this Grievous affix, especially on Tyrannical. These powder shots will do so much damage. I mean, one powder shot taking the rogue to 25%. Now, once again, both of these rogues have all 4 rogues actually have their cheat death available, so they're a little bit safer. That's why we saw the Windwalker Monk die and actually get chunked down so low. The Windwalker Monk is probably the one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, certainly very vulnerable. We've already had a death over from them. Now, part of the problem as well is that the Parrot kind of occasionally comes through the arena and charges the players, as we saw Team D get hit by there. No deaths on there. And Tree of Life coming up now from Team D's Ab, the Resto Druid, as he wants to make sure, of course, to be the closest proximity to the Parrot flying around the arena. And both of these teams have had a bit of struggle with these green pools actually splashing on top of the melee group, which that kind of combo damage in essence with moving from the tank plus one of those frontals with the shots could actually spell disaster for one of the teams.
And we talked about it at the start of the dungeon. You have that initial AoE burst of single target damage from the Unholy DK, but even with the death on the side of the Windwalker Monk, they have caught up to and surpassed the single target damage of Team D. So we'll have to see, you know, if that's going to be the case going further on the dungeon. But once again, these players dropping incredibly low as the boss is at 3%.
Team D unfortunately getting another round of charge parrot into them. No deaths on the board, and they do manage to get by from the fight. Both Rusted Dudes finally make it through and having a well-deserved fish feast at the end to make sure that they get their mana and health back up to max. Skip over here, of course, cutting the diagonal of the bridge as the rest of the team goes around. The Prot were moving up early. The Rogue actually unfortunately ate a melee to the face from the Enforcer that is guarding the bridge, but did manage to sneak by. Grievous is starting to ramp up, but there's no other action going on the board right now for Team D, so they managed to just heal him through it. And the typical fashion, we see a sap going on to the closest proximity mob here as the two teams go around the side of this hut.
And once again, this is pretty typical. We see a lot of teams pull a couple neutral mobs here to let the rogues start rolling for their buff with Roll the Bones. If they get a good buff, they'll go in, they'll do a massive pull. If they don't get good buffs, they might do a little smaller variation pull where they'll pull like maybe just the Rat Pack or something small like that.
Such is the scurvy life of a rogue on this pirate map here. Team D now just dropping off the Sanguine here to the side as they start with those Knuckle Dusters moving in. And one of the Rat Packs actually looks to be a pretty big pull coming in here from Team D as they grab some of these Rat Buccaneers too, who are just about to have a barrel of monkeys with the group. Battle for Champion, equally large pull, needing to make sure here that they kite out of the Sanguine, but there is one of the Rat Keepers in here that will drop the traps and kind of root you in place if you don't have that avatar available.
Right, and this is incredibly dangerous pull. There's just so much going on in here. There's a lot of mobs that need to be stunned if they start doing AoE Bladestorm damage. There's a lot of fixate mobs in here, so they need to make sure that they're dealing with all of these kiting and interrupts at the same time. We see 3 people in Grievous range right now which need to be healed out of it, including the tank who's kiting around, so this is just an incredibly dangerous pull in general.
Yeah, so the Knuckle Dusters, of course, also chain slow the tank with a bit of an AoE pound, making it very difficult for Long to get out. He's just not able to get healed out of that 4-stack of Grievous right now as the other teammates start getting there as well. You can see the Unholy DK struggling to get healed up. Ab having a bit of trouble catching up to everyone's health right now as he desperately kites around in circles trying to get rid of these Sanguine pools and let the mobs finally die off, so that Ab can catch up. Now, finally, the most dangerous debuff in the entire game wears off of the pack, known as Slippery Suds, which is applied by one of the Buccaneers on the side. Straight into the boss with the 40% reaping. Not even a time to breathe for Ab. This is a pretty dangerous one here, Zyro.
We finally see a team doing what I wanted them to do here. And actually, we have to mention how careful this pull had to be here. They had to make sure that they didn't drop any Sanguine on any of the 4 corners where Captain Eudora will jump to start doing her grape shot damage. So that was actually, I don't know if they meant to do that, if they like knew where she would jump to, but that was just an impressive Sanguine damage. And we see Rogue dropping incredibly low, but not proccing his cheat death. He still has it available.
So low. I mean, Ab is just getting taxed right now. People cannot get out of this this Grievous affix right now, excuse me. And the problem is with all these shots coming in on Eudora for extra splash damage, team getting clipped there by the grape shot as Eudora jumps to one of the close corners from the boss spawn. Ab is just having such struggles right now. Tree of Life has been popped and is finally ended as he's just struggling to top the team past that 90% threshold and get rid of that dot. Tank doing well here, of course, to move out of the blade and make sure that Captain Jolly reabsorbs it so that the area does not, the group does not have area denial as they get into this barrel to increase their damage by 15% on the boss.
Yeah, and they're not out of the woods yet here. They still have Grievous. They still potentially have Grievous on 2 or 3 players at a time here, especially with those powder shots going out on random players. So this is just another one of those healing intensive fights on Grievous here, and they almost managed to drop Sanguine right where Eudora is, but it's just barely out of the way. Cheat Death does get procced on one of the rogues here.
Finally procs on one of the rogues, and the neutral mobs are pulled there. Not sure if by accident or not, but nonetheless, that was very close to having Sanguine heal up Eudora, who is only now at 33% health. If they manage to pull this off, it's going to be a pretty substantial advantage. We're seeing a more traditional route come out of Battle for Champion. They have dealt with their second Reaping Wave and are stealthing over to the Ring of Booty while they were proc their third Reaping Wave, of course, being at 59%. Lightning event has already started as the team kind of gangs up on the little piggy and brings home the bacon. Battle for Champion pulling some extra mobs here to proc their third Reaping, which they'll likely drag into Ludwig von Tortolin, the kind of penultimate mini-boss before Trothak, the third boss, or typically third boss of the dungeon. But right now, honestly, Zyra, all eyes still on Team D as Captain Eudora is about to fall after what is probably one of the most aggressive pulls that we've seen across both cups so far.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned several times last week, I wanted to see teams do that pull, and we finally got a team to do it. And honestly, I mean, it didn't seem like it helped them that much. The bosses were never really stacked on top of each other to get that unholy AoE cleave damage on both bosses. So as impressive as it is that they pulled it off, I don't know if it was a huge time saver. Now, we didn't actually mention the mechanics of this boss too much outside of Captain Eudora. Last week, we had a different mechanic where we had the different brews being thrown into the arena for haste and crit buffs, as well as a physical bleed debuff. But instead, this week, we actually have these brews on the ground that will do a slight damage increase.
I think it's a nature debuff, actually, which is even more daunting for some of the members. But nonetheless, certainly a lot of damage you want to soak up on the bosses. You just don't have those available this time. As you mentioned, you have this particular barrel on the ground, increasing damage done by 15% since you stand in it. Players doing well to move out of that rupture from Jolly, that for the area denial, as they pull just a bit of extra trash on top of it to try and efficiently cleave things down. But Ab gets hit quite hard there. Unfortunately, does not fall. We don't want to see him die, Zyra. That would be very mean. Captain Jolly now at 4% as Team D looks to finish him off and kill off the small pack of trash that they pulled with it. Von Tortolan, of course, for Battle for Champion, not to be forgotten about. 67% on the board. They've dealt with their third reaping wave and are about to down this mini-boss in preparation for Trothak.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of variations here. We talked so many times about these mini-bosses in dungeons having a lot of HP, and how their reaping mobs will actually scale with how much HP the original mob have. They'll have about half the HP that the original mob have. So typically we'll see teams want to completely skip the reaping mob spawn from mini-bosses in these dungeons. Now, we have seen different variations where some teams will actually leave that mini-boss alive during Trothak so that they have something to cleave on for maybe a little extra two-target efficiency. So we'll have to see what they plan on doing with that fourth reaping wave.
Really aggressive pull coming up here. There are 3 brine scales in this pack that do massive amounts of cast damage on the tag, but also have, aside of the water bolt, they have a frontal frost cast that does immense damage to the group if not interrupted. So Long doing what he can to survive. Tree of Life has been popped, doing well here to Kite, and a lot of support coming in from the Unholy DK. We saw the grip on that far caster, so a bit of strength there for the Unholy DK being flexed as the rest of the group finishes it off. Long runs up and starts trying to grab onto Lightning, getting stunned as that little piggy gets the 5 stacks kind of taken off by being grabbed. And Team D now dealing with their third third reaping wave as Ludwig von Tortolan is spawning too.
And you can see that beautiful long line of sanguine pools just showing how good they're kiting these trash packs. A good proper kite in order to make sure these sanguine pools don't stack up and heal mobs to full is just it's the crux of these sanguine dungeons.
Yeah, that sanguine certainly dealt with well there. Team D now aggroes onto Ludwig. Long having just a bit of struggle, still has some dots left over along with the Grievous, but dots left over from the Reaping pack that Ab is going to want to dispel, of course, having access to that dispel only once every 8 seconds. Trothak down to 68%, though, once again not to be forgotten, for Battle for Champion on the left side. Not the most melee-friendly boss due to this kind of shark tornado that is happening here for Battle for Champion. Both teams kind of having that disadvantage with the full melee, but Rogues themselves having the advantage because of their increased kind of melee distance. They can stay safely outside of that Sharknado and deal maximum damage.
Right, and we're seeing that during this Ludwig von Tortolan pull that they have to be very careful with which trash they're pulling it into. If they pull too many trash mobs into it, they might accidentally spawn a Sanguine underneath von Tortolan while he's casting one of these shell bounces, which would instantly cause him to heal for 20-30%, which obviously is a bad thing considering how much health he has. So they're being very, very safe with what mobs they're pulling and when they're kiting the boss around, when they're killing the mobs. So very great Sanguine management once again out of Team D.
Yeah, that would be really bad in a shell there. Battle for Champion now at 37% on Trothak. The boss takes so long with full melee comp, but they're doing quite well, of course. You can see Jack around the outside of the arena dealing with that Sawtooth Shark right now. After this Shark Tornado, Trothak will charge and pick up that Shark, starting to drop the other one, the Hammerhead, on the group, making sure that Jack is there within proximity. It is a Hammerhead. I thought it was a Hammerhead. Okay. Making sure you get within proximity of those sharks as they will start to jump to their closest proximity target. We have one of the Frost Blasts go off for Team D as they deal with a bunch of the trash here whilst waiting for Trothak to spawn. We can see him there in the top right of the screen, just now menacingly entering the arena.
Now we see this is actually this route that Team D is running for this Unholy DK is completely different than anything we've seen so far. The fact that they were able to pull off that Reaping Wave into Council Captains and not use Bloodlust, as we see actually 2 people on the side of Battle for Champion go down right as Trothak is at 4%. That was a scary moment, but it looks like they're going to be fine. We see them once again, moving back to the side of Team D, they're pulling this 4th Reaping Wave into Trothak, and they have their Bloodlust available should they choose to use it here for the Unholy DK.
Yeah, and they will have Ludwig's Lost Soul in there as well, so that's a lot of health that they're going to have to chew through. I predict that last soul will die, I mean, like, pretty late into the encounter right now, but not too much danger. We'll provide some area denial with these shadow smashes for long and the melee. Nothing they can't handle, just a bit of an irritation as Battle for Champion now backtracks back to the Council of Captains that we saw Team D aggressively pull and kill earlier. Bloodlust has been popped for Battle for Champion here to make sure that they grind through Captain Eudora as quickly as possible. Don't want to deal with those powder shots on the group for too long, while Team D is actually holding on to theirs.
Yeah, which is kind of an interesting thing because we've talked so many times, I mean, even earlier in this dungeon, about how much of a difficult boss Trothak is for these triple melee groups. They would have to stand in and do damage during the Blade Storm for them to even, do full damage on the boss. And in this Grievous Affix, that's just, that's causing your healer headaches, really.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of dump for the healers right now. And, I'm not really shocked to see Team D not use their Bloodlust here right now. I mean, it's just not the most effective DPS boss for melee with all the running around. The Unholy DK uptime on the boss is really not very great either, as he's kiting around in circles right now. Long seems to be having some issues there in the corner. Looks like potentially a DC as he's just kind of sitting there, not being really killed either. Has he managed to reconnect? Yes, he's finally managed to back up, so perhaps a bit of a lag spike. They do well there. I really love that heads-up play. Unfortunately, a cheat death coming in for one of the rogues there, but does manage to kind of stave it off. I really love the heads-up play, though, from the Unholy DK. They noticed the issue with the Prot Warrior and immediately taunted the boss and started running away from the Prot Warrior just to kind of allow them time to regain connectivity to the fight, so they avoided what could have been, honestly, a potential team wipe.
Right, now we've mentioned the Shark Tornado on the side of Trothak here, but we haven't really gone over what the main portion of the fight is here. We see these sharks moving around the entire room, and essentially what the sharks will do is they'll fixate onto the closest player, moving ever faster. Now, the only way to slow the sharks down is to kite them over one of these pools of chum. We see these little gray pools on the ground. So typically what we'll see these teams do is we'll see them spawn a shark. Everyone but the healer will move away from the shark, and the healer will once again take the job of, doing the difficult things while the brain DPS just hit the boss the entire time.
DPS brain, Zyra, my friend. As Captain Jolly is brought into the barrel here for Battle for Champion, looking to gain that 15% damage buff and finish Mafidora, long since dead for the left side of the screen here, Battle for Champion. Now, doing really well to kind of move the saber around the edge of the barrel so that the rest of the DPS can sit in the barrel and try to get a few hits off on the boss with that 15% buff and not be completely area denied from the barrel's buff range and then in that kind of that brown circle there. A bit more trash is pulled over on the side of Battle for Champion as well to get that fourth reaping wave too.
And we're seeing that both of these teams are actually killing their boss at the exact same time pretty much here. The only major difference being that Team D has the Bloodlust available for them for the last boss or wherever they plan to use it in the end of the instance. But Battle for Champion has now finally procced their fourth reaping wave, probably opting to Shadow Meld it as they run across the bridge here.
Yeah, looks like they're Shadow Melded, but not just that, but one big difference with how close these two teams have been, ironic, is the fact that Battle for Champion has a death, and there is none on the side of Team B. Something that could once again, actually, not even for the first time, once again come into play by the end of this match that had cost Battle for Champion probably their first game because of that one death they had in front of the second boss, but who knows for sure. Team D finally crosses the bridge here as Battle for Champion deals with their Ravager pull, making sure that those painful motivations are brought in the pack, but a little bit of mismanagement here with the Sanguine as they bottleneck themselves on the bridge. Some of the mobs run through it and heal from it as well, so the group does have to kind of finish that off. They kill these Ravager packs now, so they're going to have to stealth past the officer, patrol there, move up to the boss. And, I mean, the only thing I can think about right now is a very aggressive pull with the double Enforcer pack and the final boss, Harlan.
Yeah, I imagine they'd have to do that after the boss because they don't want to deal with any of that Sanguine spawning on the boss at the last second, even though he will retain that double damage buff from entering the last phase. So we'll have to see. I mean, both of these teams need more percentage, not just from the Ravager packs, but also from something else up here.
Yeah, I think it's going to have to be that pack. Both teams entering here at 80 and 81% apiece. Team D trying to finish off their final Ravager pack here. A bit of, I was actually going to say a bit of sloppiness, but not really. But the officer healed for just so much. They killed the packs down there, and it looks like they're going to jump up and Shadow Meld the remainder of that officer pull. Really aggressive pull coming in here from Team D once again as they pop Bloodlust with the final Enforcer pack along with Harlan, so they have to be very careful on where Harlan is brought. Fortunately, he is a very mobile boss, but if he takes even one tick of Sanguine, he will heal up for a substantial amount, and he's got a lot of health.
Yeah, I actually love this idea of the pull. This completely takes advantage of the Unholy DK cleave, allowing them to get through the worst part of the fight, the 100 to 30% where the boss is taking just normal damage efficiently. Now, like you said, if he gets any of the healing off from Sanguine here, it's all for naught pretty much. They lose their Bloodlust efficiency, they lose their Unholy DK efficiency, and they're going to lose in the single target battle later on. But it looks like they're doing just fine right now. They do get one tick of
They
the
get
heal off,
one tick of
unfortunately.
5%, unfortunately, on Harlan, but really good heads-up play from the Unholy DK there. Saw that the Enforcer was about to die and death gripped one of them out of the pack just as it was about to die, making the tank's life easier to kind of backpedal, kite that boss out of there. So almost perfect pull from them and still very impressive. They will have to chew through that extra 5% of HP for Harlan as the final Reaping Wave, once again, to the strengths of the Unholy DK, come in and ravage the group. And we do have a death go down for Team D, unfortunately. No cheat death available for one of their rogues. Goes down and the battle res comes out immediately. Harlan Sweet now at 48%, well into the second phase for Battle for Champion.
Right, not only did they get the AoE and Unholy DK damage off from the pack that they pulled, but they also got the Reaping Wave afterwards. So just double dipping into that AoE. We do see more ticks of healing though coming out from the Sanguine on Harlan there. Looks like the tank got knocked back, and then Harlan followed him into in the Sanguine. So looks like 15% of the boss's health has been healed so far.
Yeah, and that's a lot of health, especially not within that kind of burn region of the sub 30%, 100% increased damage taken phase. There's finally stabilized here. All the Sanguine has now despawned from Team D's boss area. Harlan Sweet about to enter the burn phase here for Battle for Champion at 30%. Both teams doing well to root the Grenadier on either side, making sure that it does not enter the pack and splash a bunch of damage. Ab actually just runs right through it to make sure it doesn't reach the rest of the group, and he takes the hit.
Yeah, like we've mentioned, this is, well, we haven't mentioned it yet, this dungeon, but this is a 3-phase encounter. Once they hit 60%, the boss will start targeting all of the players with every single one of his abilities. And also, once he hits 30%, like we've seen Battle for Champion hit, he will start to take double damage in addition to also gaining 100% attack speed. So, lots of tank damage and also double damage taken as they pull the boss into that pack that we saw Team D pull earlier.
So here comes the predicted aggressive pull from Battle for Champion. Harlan Sweet about to fall here as he's melting with that 100% increased damage taken for the group. A lot of damage coming into the group. Harlan does fall. They just need to kind of stabilize here and finish it off, but 4 stacks of Grievous for the Windwalker Monk as the healer is struggling to keep everyone alive right now. Both teams with 1 death apiece. Harlan at 46% for Team D. They've already dealt with their trash component, but it looks like Battle for Champion will be able to take this final game as they only have these 2 sub 20% health enforcers left. One is about to go down right now, and the second falls shortly after. Battle for Champion grabs the series 2-1 over Team D.
Excellent performance here by Battle for Champion, the #1 seed, moving on to that grand finals here without dropping any series, only dropping 1 map so far. Very impressive performance, but also that last boss, Sours. We got to talk about that last boss and how both teams were kind of executing and trying to work off that friendly fire a little bit.
Yeah, that was crazy. So the Team D pulled everything with the boss, and then Battle for Champion pulled everything at the very end of the boss as opposed to on pull. And I guess it worked out better for them. They didn't have Bloodlust, but they just had enough damage. They were able to deal with the boss cleanly. They didn't have anything to worry about, no Sanguine issues, nothing at all. They had a smooth, easy ride. They were able to get through all the mechanics and then bring the boss in at 3% health to the trash back as opposed to about 100% health, where the risk of healing the boss any amount with Sanguine is very dangerous. And that's just the story of this kind of series we've had with these two teams, where boss 1 was very close, and then both teams diverged their route drastically for how they approached boss 2 and 3, with Team D going and killing Council first and looking like they were maybe a little bit ahead. They killed it much, much faster, of course, than Battle for Champion was able to kill Trothak. But then both teams come back and they kill their third boss at the exact same time. They're neck and neck all the way to the very end, and Battle for Champion squeezes it out.